All right. Hello, everyone. So great to see everyone and where they're calling in from. We're so excited to have you here today for our panel on reimagining aging, and really speaking about loneliness and human connection in Canada and what we can do to support everyone to age better, which is such an important topic as we know that the aging population is only getting bigger. And, we really want to have the systems, structures, and support in place as our population continues to age. And so, with that, I'd love to welcome us all to the space. Again, feel free to drop in, share where you're calling in from, what you're excited to learn about today. Um, and yeah, we're going to dive in. This is a part of the campaign we run called Seniors Loneliness Awareness Week, which we run here at Genwell, which is Canada's Human Connection movement. And Seniors Loneliness Awareness Week was really born out of the realization that we know that about 30% of older adults right now are facing social isolation in Canada. And about half the people in Canada right now say that they feel lonely on a regular or weekly basis. And so this is a huge issue that's impacting so many people. And yet, up until about a year or two ago, we weren't even talking about loneliness or social connection and how those impact our physical and our mental health. So, Seniors Loneliness Awareness Week is really about raising awareness of the issue of loneliness and how it's impacting older adults across Canada. But more importantly, we created this week to talk about the solution to loneliness, which is focusing on human connection. Because we know that when people have supports from their family, their friends, their neighbors, their colleagues, their classmates, the people they volunteer with or just see out in the community, that we have the supports to age well, to age in place, and for every part and every member of society to contribute in a meaningful way. And so, with that, I'm excited to introduce our incredible panelists that we'll have today to kind of guide this conversation. First up, we have Dr. Rachel Savage. She is a scientist at the Women's Age Lab and Women's College Research Institute, Women's College Hospital, and an adjudicate scientist at ICES and an assistant professor at the Institute of Health Policy, Management, and Evaluation at U of T. So lucky and excited to have Rachel here with us to share her expertise. Because at the Women's Age Lab, Dr. Savage leads health services research focused on social connection and health system use in older adults with a sex and gender-based analysis plus lens. She leads research funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research that evaluates how loneliness in older adults impacts healthcare transitions, as well as how enhancements to naturally occurring retirement communities can actually improve social connection and support older adults to age in their community, which I'm so excited to talk to you more about today. We also have Dr. Jacques Lee here, who is a lovely husband, father, an emergency room physician, and clinical scientist focused on improving the care of older people who come to the ED through science. He is extremely grateful to the Schwartz Riesman, I hope I said that right.
You got it.
Thank you. Emergency Medicine Institute, because their generosity has actually enabled him to share the work that he's about to share and present with us today. So thank you so much for being here, because I know you're doing huge work as well in the healthcare system and really supporting those preventative lenses that we can look at to support people to age well. And then finally, we have Dr. Heather Palmer, who's a clinical scientist specializing in brain behavior relationships. She is the founder of Maximum Capacity, which operates both in Canada and the US, providing brain fog programs designed to help people improve how they think, feel, and function. Heather has also been published in scientific journals and spoken internationally on the topics of cancer-related brain fog, dementia, cognitive rehabilitation, seniors' brain health, social isolation, and loneliness. And she has been featured on television and radio as a leading expert in these fields and is also on our scientific advisory board too, and has been a long time standing champion of GenWell. So we're so excited to have you all here to share your expertise. Um, because as you know, and I think we kind of mentioned before, it's 2025, and we're only now truly beginning to talk about how loneliness and a lack of social connection impacts our physical and our mental well-being, which is kind of crazy when we think about the research that, Julian Holt-Lunstad has shown that's, a lack of social connection is worse for our health than, pollution, smoking, obesity, high blood pressure, and yet, has been relatively invisible in the conversation, especially around our health and wellness. So, the first thing I'd love, and I'm going to kind of throw this out to whoever wants to answer this, is, why do you think it is that we're only now just starting to talk about this problem? And how did we get here in our society where we're dealing with loneliness only after it leads to things like dementia or heart disease or depression, especially in older adults? So I'd love maybe if each of you would just want to take a minute or two to share your perspective on how we got here and why we're only just starting to talk about this now. And maybe I'll start with you, Rachel, if
Sure.
so.
Yeah, so I think this is a great question. In my opinion, it's probably a combination of a couple of things. So the first is, although loneliness is not new, it's a relatively new social phenomenon. And by that, I mean we've really only been studying the linkages between loneliness and health over the last, 40 years or so. You mentioned that seminal paper from Julianne Holt-Lunstad that came out in 2015 showing that loneliness increases our risk for premature mortality by about 30%. And so I think really since that time, we now have robust evidence of the profound, health effects of loneliness on humans. But I think we're just really starting to get to that place where now we know we need to do something about it. The health evidence is really clear, and we're starting to understand the underlying mechanisms of how loneliness is harmful to our bodies. And then maybe the second thing I would say is there's probably also a misconception that we all innately know how to connect with others. You hear all the time humans are social beings, but we're not all given the same conditions that we need, to develop and maintain healthy and meaningful relationships throughout our lives. And I think we're seeing more and more that some of those conditions are changing over time, and it's leading to increases in the prevalence of loneliness in populations within Canada and around the world. So I think those two things together are really starting to drive the conversation about the need to address loneliness in the population.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Anything you'd like to add, Jacques?
Yeah, I was thinking about this. I have this sort of slide I often present. So we started to know about the effects of smoking in the 50s, and maybe we had some solid evidence, by the 70s, and then there's this, there was this long lag between that and the adoption, So part of it is just it takes time for science to get out there, for people to start thinking about it. For me, it was a COVID project. I had a guy who had I was working the emerge at Mount Sinai. I had a guy who basically begged to be sent in an ambulance because he had survived COVID. It was a sort of like late April, right? He got sick in very early on in the pandemic, and even after he recovered. They locked him in his room in his seniors living space for like 6 weeks with like people in hazmat suits shoving food under the door. He had no human contact. And he was suffering, and I was trying to figure, why are you here? How can I help you? And it was just like, God, don't send me back, man. I'm so lonely. It was just that moment, and so yeah, started reading about it and discovering this huge, huge wealth. And if I can quote Dr. Vivek Murtry, who the former Attorney General, Surgeon General of the U.S. It's like, the problem with loneliness is, like to admit that you're lonely is to admit that you're unlikable or even worse, unlovable. So there's this huge stigma that goes with it, right? So it's a disease we didn't know about, came to light maybe in COVID a little bit, plus it's a type of thing that people feel like maybe it's their fault that they don't have connection, that maybe there's something wrong with them. And similarly, other people, it's like, you want to take money away from diabetes, for lonely people, so I think part of the thing is you've just got to follow the numbers. The magnitude of the impact means we can no longer ignore it.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I know we often say that here, we were educated over 50 years about the importance of exercise and not smoking. And, it's taken 50 plus years for us to get to the point where we've integrated more of that into how we all just take care of our health and well-being. And as we were saying, social connection and loneliness weren't even really spoken about until, a lot of the research came out only in the last like decade, 15 years ish. Um, and similarly, what you were saying about stigma, we talk about that a lot, which is why Genwell focuses so much on human connection as opposed to loneliness, because we know loneliness is the issue. But as you said, when we have to say, I feel lonely, it might come with those feelings of there's something wrong with me or no one likes me. But instead, when you're like, hey, do you want to get connected with someone? Do you actually like being, with other people? You're like, oh, yeah, I like that. That sounds fun. I can try that. Which is why, even when we talk about seniors loneliness awareness, we frame the focus on the solution, which is connection. So I love that you brought that there. Heather, anything you want to add?
Um, sure. I think I agree. I think that that's everything both Rachel and Jack have said are very important. For me, I find it like an ironic combination of antiquated beliefs, which is similar to the stigma, and what makes it ironic is it's antiquated beliefs and modern technology that I think are really contributing significantly here. So, those antiquated beliefs, I'm fine, I'm strong, I don't need help, I'm hiding my feelings and my emotions, as opposed to reaching out, seeking help. I mean, fortunately, we're seeing a big turn in the right direction there where people are more in touch with their emotions and sharing them with other people. But I think in particular, when we're talking about seniors, they come from a generation and a time where it was buck up, shoulders up, and you're fine. And then when you combine that with modern technology, I think what we're seeing is that more and more we're seeing reduced and in many cases completely eliminated naturally occurring circumstances where people connect. So if you think from the most basic function, we've gone from, a fair amount of time inside a bank to using bank machines, where even then you still get to encounter people and talk to somebody who else is in line, right to online banking, where most of our banking we do online in the privacy of our own home, from depositing checks to ordering foreign currency. You just have to go into the bank to actually pick it up. And then there's all of the other modern technology. We can order most of our foods and everything we need to survive online. Even when you call a contact a service for some type of support, your first option is a chat bot. Your second option is an AI operator. And eventually, if you can figure out the system, you might get a live person. So it's both in person and over the phone that I think modern technology has taken away a lot of wonderful opportunities for people to just have simple conversations with strangers, which, as we all know, are mood boosters. And those aren't happening as frequently as they used to.
Yes, 100%. I think again, like a big reason for the Seniors Loneliness Awareness Week is to encourage people to have those little micro moments of connecting again with older
Mm-hmm.
adults in their lives, because as you said, like these moments are just disappearing, especially with the advent of technology, which we know just got more intense through COVID as well with the disconnect there. So yeah, thank you all for sharing very concrete points around why, we're just having this conversation now, even though we know it's a massive health crisis. And we know the World Health Organization just the other week came out saying that every country needs to focus on developing policies, procedures, and programs to support connection because it's such a big health crisis right now. So I'd love to dive deeper actually into, how loneliness is actually showing up in older adulthood and really what we're still missing and, why this matters so much. And so, Rachel, I'd love to know, especially in your research, how do you distinguish between occasional loneliness, and chronic or persistent loneliness? And why does that distinction matter when we look at public health planning and policy?
Yeah, thanks, Bobby. Well, I think it comes down to how long we feel lonely or the duration of our loneliness. So, occasional loneliness is what I would call like a temporary emotional state. So, you feel these feelings for a limited amount of time. Occasional or transient loneliness is often triggered by specific events. So think about if you have to move your home, you have to move to a new location, or if you lose a partner or a friend. Um, it's something most of us, I think, have experienced at one point, at least in their lives. For me, I had a period after my first son was born, where I became a mother for the first time. It was a big identity shift, and with that loss of identity and finding my new identity, it was a really lonely period in my life. But transient loneliness often resolves within a short-ish period of time, kind of naturally or by you re-engaging in social contact and recognizing that need and reaching out and sort of making some changes so you no longer feel those emotions. Chronic loneliness, on the other hand, is when those feelings of loneliness persist, like weeks, months, even years. And when we're looking at linkages between loneliness and health, it's really the chronic loneliness that we're most concerned about because that's what's really been shown to be linked with these adverse health outcomes that we've been talking about. So, really serious conditions like cancer, dementia, diabetes, heart disease, stroke. Anxiety, depression. And the other difference between transient and chronic loneliness is sort of how we relate to others. So while chronic loneliness often makes us retreat and withdraw from others, transient loneliness actually usually encourages us. It's our body sending us a signal that we need to reach out and connect with others. So I think the big challenge with chronic loneliness, and I hear this all the time when I'm presenting and speaking with people, is, if I knew how to be less lonely, I would do it. It really is something that when you're starting to feel that way all of the time, it becomes really challenging to get out of that mindset and reestablish trust and connection with others. And we often need help to get there.
Yeah, beautiful. I love what you shared. And I'm curious then, like, how much attention do you feel like we should be putting on educating the broader population about the importance of their social health and connecting with one another as a way to kind of prevent, this transient loneliness from becoming chronic, as well as to support, as we're saying, like, building those micro moments of connection into our daily lives. So again, it doesn't become chronic. Um,
Yeah, I think it's really important, the education piece. And Jacques was saying it really nicely in the opening question that there is a stigma associated with loneliness. A lot of people think that they're lonely because of something innate within them, their personality or how they relate to the world. And when I talk about loneliness, I often try to focus on what we know are some of the broader factors that contribute to loneliness. And I think people are often surprised to learn that a lot of these factors are things that are beyond our control, right? Losing a partner, um, you know, changes in health and mobility, retirement. Some of these things are expected, some of these things are completely unplanned. And it also matters, our social identities, sex and gender play a really important role, income, how our identities are either given privilege or marginalized in society in ways that can exclude people, especially those with disabilities and that identify as sexual minorities and gender minorities, for example. And where we live makes a big difference too. So, if we live and grow up in a community that's safe, walkable, has accessible transit, lots of access to parks and amenities, there's more opportunities for social interaction. And, when we live in places that have high social cohesion, we really reap the benefits of it. So there are a lot of things beyond an individual's control that play into it. And that's why we really need to start thinking about loneliness more from a public health perspective and less of, here as an individual, these are things that you should be doing. That's important, but there's also really, I think, policies and important structural determinants that we need to address to get at the root of this issue.
Yes, absolutely. It's so important. And we know that, as you're saying, because this is a public health issue, that we're seeing, increased demand for emergency room visits and services, that sometimes, our systems don't fully have the capacity to support right now. And so I'd be really curious, actually, from your perspective, Jacques, in emergency room medicine, how do you see social isolation contributing to preventable health crises among older adults? And yeah, what's that looking like in the health sphere?
Thanks. Yeah. So again, like I gotta, I'm a trained clinical epidemiologist, and like I'm not a social scientist. I say my qualifications for working in loneliness is I know how to read and I know where the library is, or I guess now where the internet is. But that being said, that story I told you was really sort of the first inkling, because I could connect with this individual suffering, and that led me to read about it and go, oh wow, there's like this iceberg, right, with this huge, um, incredible body of knowledge about it, about how bad this is for you. So I think, this is fantastic, Jenwell, because it's just like, oh my God, smoking's bad for you, right? So for my colleagues, in the emergency department, it's like, hey, check that vital sign, right? Check what their connectedness is. It's just something that was completely new. To anybody who listens to this podcast, right? We make life choices, and we may make choices that isolate us more and go, well, it doesn't matter, right? But I think as we're transitioning from the greatest generation, to sort of the boomers like me who are a little bit more involved in their own agendas and a little less stoic, that realizing that isolation. I've had personal experience with this, like realizing that making choices that make me more isolated is actually not just you know, sad in some ways, but it's actually bad for my health, and that's something I need to pay attention to. So I think just raising that awareness for individuals, um, um, just raising that ideas of connectives for individuals and in the healthcare department, But we're really at the very beginning. So I think I'm here in this panel because I led a randomized clinical trial where we connected older people to chatting with similar older volunteers for half an hour for 12 weeks, And one of the things we're realizing is we don't even know how to measure loneliness. There's all these scales, right? But if I'm as an emergency physician, how do I measure loneliness, right? So some of our research, we're actually trying to develop a single question that's easy to remember that clinicians can ask of older people to see if to just check in if they're lonely, just to get an idea, And we modified an existing question. We got rid of the word lonely. So what we're testing now is, do you often feel on your own, And they can have answers of, no, I'm not on my own. Yes, but it doesn't bother me, which is an important sort of caveat, because it lets people sort of say, yeah, maybe I'm a little lonely without admitting they're lonely. Yes, it bothers me moderately. Yes, it bothers me severely. So my summer student this summer is actually calling a whole bunch of people who went home from the emergency department and checking if this single question will be of use. So we're really at the beginning. Like there's, in terms of how we treat it on the front lines, there's no prescriptions yet. I'd love to explore what Jenna will have to offer. There's no test for it, so we're really at the beginning, and we need to do this work. And we need to, as the scientist, as the nerd, as a nerd in the room, we really do need to not just do stuff, but evaluate it to see if it's working.
Yeah, I love what you're sharing, Jock. I recently just read an article from Julianne Holt-Lunstad. She's like a leading researcher on social connection, and she was sharing in her research essentially that it's been essentially an invisible healthcare issue for a lot of people, specifically because we know that we haven't educated the general population about it, but we also haven't been educating doctors about social connection and the importance of our health and wellness. And as you said, how to actually measure loneliness in the patients they're working with and monitor that, and then even have the tools, the time, the resources to support that way. So thank you for bringing that there, because I think we are right at the precipice of this brand new model. And, I know there's a lot of work right now in the community to explore models and ways that we can maybe support that work. So, very curious and interesting times to see how this is going to build so that we can integrate this more into every level of our community, our healthcare systems, so that, we don't have so many people falling through the cracks and ending up with emergency room services when, they could have maybe been supported at home in the community if they had more of those connections. So love that. And I'd be curious to hear from your perspective, Heather, how is loneliness impacting the cognitive health of older adults? And what do we know about the protective role that meaningful social connection can play in actually supporting our brain health as we age?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's a really important question because there's no question that loneliness has an impact on our cognitive health and our brain. Because simply put, our brains are at their healthiest when there's engaging activity that involves multiple regions of the brain. So when people feel lonely or they feel isolated, their brain is much less likely to be engaging in a multimodal or multi-region kind of way. But then we get the flip side, and I think this is where we see a big challenge in this particular space is there's generally a lack of understanding around the brain-related changes that happen as we get older. So quite often, many of the solutions that are proposed, the way the brain has changed as a part of normal aging, and if there's an abnormal aging process going on, there can be barriers that are created because of those brain-related changes. So, for example, as we get older, our frontal lobes start to change a little bit more than some of the other regions, and this can affect taking initiative. So some of the solutions to loneliness requires taking initiative to get yourself out. Or another frontal lobe process is decision making. So a solution to loneliness is being able to make decisions about what you're going to do and who you're going to engage in with. Another one is organizing and planning. So oftentimes the solutions that are created or proposed and encouraged, there are these hidden barriers that those who are making and coming up with these solutions are not necessarily considering how an aging brain is processing these changes and how they're able to problem solve their way out of it, even with support. And that's what I really liked about, part of Jacques' research that he just mentioned, that they started almost a peer support where a senior was talking to a senior. And that's fantastic because they're both talking from the perspective of aging brains and have more similar lived experiences as they're going through it. whether the peer supporter is lonely or not, at least from an aged brain perspective, they have a similarity to the person that they're supporting. And then in terms of the protective role, if we keep thinking about the brain, for decades, people have been asking me, what is the best exercise I can do for my brain? Is it crosswords? Is it Sudoku? Should I be learning another language, taking up a musical instrument? And hands down, while all of those are absolutely fantastic because they're engaging the brain, I have said for almost more than 3 decades now that the best exercise for our brain is social communication and connection. Because when you are communicating and connecting with another person, you are using your brain in a multifunction type of way. You are listening to what they're saying and processing the information. You're digging up what your response might be, usually finding facts or figures or information that you've stored. You are then about to prepare your response, so you're digging up the words that you want, and then somebody else in the conversation pipes in with their thoughts, so now you're reprocessing all over the way. So in the perspective of actively using your brain, social communication and connection is probably one of the best exercises we can get for using multiple regions in a single circumstance.
That's so cool. I love that. I'm also like a brain nervous system nerd and always love to study that. And it is amazing. It uses every part of our brain in a really powerful way. Um, so thank you for bringing that into the conversation around how it supports us to age well and keep our brain healthy as we go, because, we know that, as Heather mentioned, we really want to prevent loneliness from becoming chronic, because that's when we see that decline in our brain health, in our heart health, in a variety of our health and wellnesses. So, I think it's so important that we continue to look at how we can take more connected approaches to aging, in our homes, in our healthcare systems, and in our communities as a whole. Um, and so with that, actually, Heather, I'm going to go back to you. Curious, we know some people are calling it the silver tsunami that's coming, that many people are going to be retiring very soon. And as we said, we have a growing population that's, aging out of the workforce. And so with that, curious, how do you think we can design more connected, retirement homes, and different environments and communities that foster a true sense of inclusion, belonging, and connection for older adults? Um, yeah.
Yeah, I love the question, Bobby, because I think it's not an easy one to answer because I think there's a whole multitude of ways that we can do that. For me, I would take everything and probably break it down into 3 core categories. And those 3 core categories would be design, programming, and training. So from a design perspective, you can create spaces, especially if it's a congregate living type of environment, that has much more comfy and inclusive, attractive gathering spots where people are naturally inclined to come to these areas. Dining rooms, instead of having the more standard 2 and 4 seat tables, have a couple of family style dining experiences where it's a much longer table of 8 or 10 and the food is presented in platters on the table and they're serving each other, because that creates connection and community and feelings of belonging. Artwork can be very interactive. So just from a design perspective, what you're putting on the walls, it can be interactive and conversation pieces as opposed to it being, a piece of art that's just pleasing to the eye. It should be purposefully chosen to create that feeling of connection. Individual rooms or suites can have shadow boxes outside so that somebody walking down the hall gets to know a little bit about the person who's living behind that door, and that can create opportunity for conversation and engagement. So there's all kinds of super simple, not terribly expensive building as well as design opportunities that promote in a very natural way engagement, conversation, and connectedness. And then, of course, there's the programming end of things. From the programming perspective, we need to make sure whoever is setting up activities or calendars, especially if it's in a retirement or long-term community, that it's not stagnant, that it's not just a rotating calendar of bingo every Monday. You need to know who the people are, and that's constantly changing, and the people's likes and dislikes are changing themselves. So constant awareness of what people want, creating lots of options and alternatives, activities where people are working together. So I love residences that have a common cooking space, or they're doing chores together, because all of those create opportunity. It brings purpose and meaning to the activities. Generally, if somebody is, fairly far along in their journey of dementia, they're still very capable of participating in those activities. And it creates a feeling of, I belong here, I'm an active and important member of this community, and I feel good about myself and what I'm doing. And so just quickly to refer to the third one is training. You have to train your team members to have person-centered approaches and to understand the individual nature of each person that they are serving and supporting, and create opportunities on an individual basis for people to participate and engage, and recognizing that not everybody likes the same thing, and sometimes people are going to be active participants just sitting in the background and watching, which is still very healthy, as opposed to being in their room on their own. And others will be very active participants. So recognizing that passive participation is still, an important part of engaging and feeling like you're belonging. So I think there's lots that we can do, and they're all very simple, whether they're in the kinds of communities that, the naturally occurring retirement communities, or if they're purpose-built retirement communities or long-term care homes. I don't think it's terribly difficult. I think it's just something that we need to recognize and do better at.
Thank you so much, Heather. And actually, speaking about naturally occurring retirement communities, I know, Rachel, you studied a lot of these community-based models where groups of older adults are supported to age in place together. And so I'd be really curious to hear more of what you've seen as the greatest potential of these models, and what could be possible if more people intentionally aged alongside friends or peers, with connection in mind.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Bobby. So, maybe for those of you that have never heard of a naturally occurring retirement community before, these are just simply geographic areas where a lot of older adults have naturally clustered over time. So, in cities, for example, NORCs often form in high-rise buildings, so condos or apartment buildings, where on average we would say maybe 30% or greater the population within that building are older adults. And this happens because people either age in place in the buildings that they live in, or because people are moving here to these types of communities because they want to be closer to amenities and have, less maintenance relative to a big home, changes in health, and maybe changes in finances over time. And so I think one of the really cool things about NORCs is that they, on their own, can't, strengthen social connection. They're just, average apartment buildings, but we can enhance these buildings and communities with programming and supports, like supportive service programs, which, can really make these places of connection where everyone knows each other and works together to support each other and help people stay in their homes for longer. And so these programs are really taking more of an upstream preventative approach to health that we were talking about earlier. So by fostering group, coffee socials, group wellness activities, yoga, and things like that, fitness classes, digital literacy workshops. And really, it should be determined by the needs of the residents that are living there. So these programs are often initiated by the residents, trying to be responsive to the needs that they see locally within their communities. And as you mentioned, at Women's Age Lab, we're studying the implementation of supportive service programs in NORCs across Toronto and Barrie, so that we can learn how to spread them to more communities, because the evidence shows that these really can strengthen social connection, alleviate loneliness, and delay transitions to long-term care. And the potential is huge. In Ontario alone, there's close to 2,000 buildings that meet this definition of a NORC. So that's, I think, close to 200,000 older adults. And so I think we really need to be thinking about how do we leverage things like this that already exist in our communities as like key strategies for strengthening social connection and supporting aging in place. And you know, the benefits are huge. So people that live in communities that have been enhanced this way really talk about having a sense of connection, knowing their neighbors, you know, having people who call them if they don't show up to something and check in on them, able to lift a ride from someone, or, you know, people that drop by soup when they're sick. Like these are communities that we all want to live in. And I think it's just sort of bringing that formalization of, you know, how do we make this work in the places that we live, so that people feel like they're part of something and connected to the people around them.
Yes. I think what I love most about Norks, and it's kind of what Heather was saying, is like there's those intentional spaces where, as you're saying, Rachel, people come together and, check if someone hasn't shown up in a couple days and they're normally around, like, hey, what's up? Or, to bring people soup. And, it's those small micro ways that we used to connect all the time that Heather was talking about, that especially in the last, research by Dr. Robert Putnam shows since about the 1960s onwards has continued to diminish in our communities, which is so sad. And I think we're seeing the impacts of that, which is like rampant loneliness and disconnection across our communities. And um, I think this is, again, this is what we're always talking about at Genwell. We're always harping on people, what are those little ways that we can connect, talk to an older adult neighbor, invite them out for a coffee, like go for a walk, say hi to the person at the grocery store. It's those small things that really make us feel connected. And so, going back and thinking about the fact that we know that loneliness is causing, a major public health crisis right now, and that we're seeing increased demand for emergency room services, and healthcare services, because sometimes people really don't have the connections they need, to support that. I'd be curious, like I know, Jacques, you've said, you've really emphasized the need for upstream solutions, to some of the issues we're seeing with older adults, in medicine. And so I'm curious, again, I think you were kind of speaking to this a little bit earlier about, what impact could a more connected, proactive approach to aging have on our healthcare system? And, what do you think needs to shift to really make connection a priority? Um,
There's so many thoughts on this. So first, gratitude to have been invited to this panel because I've learned so much. I really have to riff on what Rachel and Heather said. Dr. Samir Sinha, our former chief geriatrics here, did a white paper on long-term care and nursing homes, which in Canada were the worst performers in the G7 during the COVID crisis. And you know, just the whole idea that that's the model is so problematic. The sardine is made to fit the can. The only justification, long-term care facilities essentially take like the 1950s Francis Farmer mental health institution and make it the standard for older people. And my goodness, I hope I'm a good enough parent that my children never put me in long-term care. My parents live in a NORC that's called the Island of Vancouver, specifically Parksville, right? Where my brother, the retired Buddhist monk, is caring for my two parents in their home. It is the only way they would definitely be in long-term care if not for that. And my dad took a ride on a Harley from without a helmet, I would add, from his neighbor in this, small community, right? Just about all of the connections and advantages, to that type of living. But I think we really need to break the model. The flip side is that they recently did a survey, and while older retired people had really high quality of life, the younger people who lived in that community had much lower quality of life and happiness, you know. And so because they can't afford homes, and all the retired people have bought the homes that are now unaffordable. So thinking about these boutique kind of long living arrangements where it's six people, right? Um, Sharing resources, not these huge institutions that the only reason they're there is efficiency of scale, so that they can deliver fewer services at lower costs. That's the only justification for it, really. They never provide, and also, like, for God bless them, the not-for-profits, did have to fill this huge need, because nobody else is filling the need. But getting us to a site like, so maybe it's younger people partnering with older people to provide a mutually beneficial living arrangement. And then the younger, if you don't have family, then the younger person who's living with you and taking care of your adopted family can go on to help you. And these, in Denmark, they have these communities where, it's like, um, dementia care, where there's a garden that has a maze that always leads you back, so they don't have to have locked doors and walls, right? So I really like breaking this. I think really one of the things we need to do is break the idea that long-term nursing homes is your destination, right? And how can we get rid of them almost entirely? Save them, for certain specific, really necessary needs, and make them better. So sorry, that's a bit of a rant, but I really do passionately believe that all of this work for Genuel is working towards a future which is necessary. Like, we are going to have to find different ways to care for our silver tsunami of super aging population, right? And I think there's you can usually, if you get together, buy get multi-level housing that allows intergenerational living, so people can afford to live together and provide the care, and really replicate what society always was, where elders were respected, valued, they shared what they had with the younger generation, and not this sort of, I don't know, fetishization of old age, where you're over in your corner on your own and you can't talk to younger people. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's officially a rant. I think I'm done.
I loved that, Rand. I was here for it. Yeah, I mean, for the purposes of this conversation, because we only have an hour and I feel like we could talk about this all day, especially with the expertise in the room. 100% what you were saying, especially with the intergenerational relationships and society, how it used to be, which was eldership was a huge role. And it was so important for younger people to be connected to older people, and everyone had a part to play in society. And we've lost that a lot now. And as we're seeing that not-for-profits and a lot of the healthcare system are taking on the burden of trying to play that community role for everyone, which, we know the community used to fill with all those micro moments of connection we were talking about, with friends, with neighbors, with family, with people we volunteered with and joined clubs with, etc. And so so important that, as you said, we break that mold and find these ways that we can build those micro moments of connection back up, and really help people understand that we all have a role to play. Because I notice this sometimes in our communities too. It's, um, you know, oh, I see that's a big issue, but that's not a me issue. That's a them issue. There's nothing I can do for this. And, that's a big part of what we're trying to talk about with Seniors Loneliness Awareness Week is, you know what? Yes, there is. Have you texted your grandma lately? Or like, oh, did you notice, like, there's an older adult at the grocery store every day that you could like say hi to? Or, as Heather was saying, maybe you're an older adult yourself and you're the one who's always connecting your group and inviting your friends out to clubs. Like, we all have a little role we can play in finding a way to help people feel connected. And so, with that, Heather, or actually, I'll direct this to Rachel. I know you've worked with Genwell before, and you and Pete have been on panels. And so I'd be curious from your perspective, like, how do you see national movements, like Genwell with the role we're doing with trying to, educate people and bring tools to support them connecting? How do you see us playing a role in building a more connected society where we can actually help prevent loneliness before it becomes a major health crisis?
Yeah, well, we need political support and I think champions for this issue. And I think, now we're starting to see, you mentioned the new formation of the Commission on Social Connection by the World Health Organization. I think that's going to be really instrumental. And, Jacques was talking about in the US, the former Surgeon General was a huge champion for the issue of loneliness and social connection, and even released a public advisory on that issue with recommendations of how we can strengthen social connection in our communities. And so I think what we need is, and we've called for at Women's Age Lab and with an intersectoral collaboration that we have formed, a national strategy here in Canada that strengthens social connection, especially for older adults. But it's an issue that spans age, and we're seeing now with more recent surveillance data that younger adults are actually the loneliest demographic in Canada, and really speaks to, I think, the potential of intergenerational connections for solving and helping address an issue that affects both young and older populations, but really all ages. And so I think one of the things that we called for in the policy brief, where we were calling for a national strategy, was we need to champion the importance of social connection. And I think that's where Genwell has a really important role to play, and has been playing a massive role for, you said 9 years now. And so I think we need to help the public understand the importance of social connection, but not leaving them afraid if, they are lonely, that now there's a whole host of bad things that are going to happen to them. So educating on the importance of social connection, but also linking them with resources that they can use to help address, their loneliness and alleviate it. So there's really important work to do to destigmatize the issue. And I mentioned earlier at the start that not all of us have, the conditions we need to be able to develop and foster meaningful relationships throughout our lives. And I think that's where education has a huge role to play. And I know that you're a leader in that space as well. So even from, I notice with my daughter, she's 5, she comes home from a play date and she is on top of the world. Like, we know very, very early the importance and impact that social connections, feeling understood, feeling connected, being part of something, what a positive impact it has. So even in those young ages, starting to educate on how we can form those relationships and maintain them, even when things go wrong and when things are stacked against us, I think is really, really important. So we're really grateful to the work that you're doing, and championing the importance of research as well to help address this issue.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And thank you for bringing in the piece around intergenerational need, and the fact that this is now impacting everyone, not just older adults, and something we really need to look at in the future for our young people as well. And Heather, I'd love to hear, because I know you've been a longstanding champion of Genwell, as well as being a member of our scientific advisory panel. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts as well on the role you think Genwell can play in building a more socially connected Canada, where, older adults can live happier, healthier, more connected lives as they age.
Mhm.
Yeah, I find this a hard question personally, because I, as you know, sing the praises of Genwell, and I think that there's two very key components of what needs to happen in the present for now. And I think you're hitting the nail on the head with those. And those are awareness and education. Really great campaigns trying to create awareness and understanding. And then from an education perspective, especially when we think about the seniors, the work that you're doing personally, Bobby, going literally face to face into communities and teaching people the impact of loneliness on a senior and the solutions and the toolkits. I think they're all fantastic. Not too dissimilar to what Rachel was saying, I do think that if we want to look to the future and make significant impact for our future generations, we need to look at systems that are currently in place that everybody is a part of, and how can we start to integrate some of this knowledge and understanding and education. So I think of our public school system, or our school system period. So everybody goes through the school system, maybe not as far as each other, but everybody is a part of the school system. And I think it would be absolutely wonderful if we could have a progressive curriculum that has this as a topic. So at the young age that Rachel was sharing about her daughter, part of the discussion in kindergarten class, what did you do for the weekend? And how did that make you feel? How do you think it made others feel who weren't a part of it? Right through to, if you look at grade 9, we have the civics and careers course that everybody is obligated to take. So why can't we integrate something about the understanding of loneliness so that the next generation of people who are going through our school system every year in some aspect of the course or the curriculum, this is being taught, this is being understood. And it doesn't have to just be loneliness and social isolation, but it can be some broader topics that are tapping into this as well. And I can't think of any other system we have that everybody goes through that can catch people early, that can keep it going, so that they're now people have been hopefully choosing careers that's making a greater impact in the senior space and the loneliness space, because they've been informed and educated about it very early on and continuously along the way.
Beautiful. Well, thank you all so much for this beautiful conversation. It was so enriching and enlivening and deep, and I really appreciate your expertise and taking your time. I just want to check in here. We started 5 minutes late, but I want to honor everyone's time. Are you open if we stay on 5 minutes and just see if there's a couple questions we can answer? Or do people have to hop off right now? Okay. Beautiful. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. I'm just going to link here that if you want to learn more about this topic, and actually we have another panel coming up next week, June 12th from 1 to 2 p.m. On caregivers and the role of caregiving in Canada and how Connection can support that. So definitely check that out. I'll pop it in the chat. You can sign up for there. And if you want to learn more about Seniors Loneliness Awareness Week, you can head to www.lonelinessawarenessweek.ca to learn more. And we're encouraging everyone to get involved, whether that is, giving a call to an older adult in your life, having a coffee, going for a walk, because, as you heard the panelists share today, every little action we take makes a difference in people's lives. And connection is not a luxury. It is a foundational health need for us all. So with that, I'd love to open it up to the audience. If there's any questions anyone has, feel free. You can raise your hand or unmute, or feel free to pop it in the chat. We'll try to take a couple questions. Beautiful. Travis says, what an excellent panel. Thank you so much. Any questions, anyone?
I was hoping to ask the panel, just in reflection of this great. First of all, say thank you. That was amazing, and all of you keep up the work you're doing. It's very, very vital. I was just curious at whether or not to ask you if anybody or any of you have any resources or strategies that you employ or use or guidance. I find that in terms of connectiveness, in terms of conversations and spending time face to face, our society does a really good job to divide people in such that, it's can be tough sometimes because what they see in the morning paper or on television or whatever is just, if it becomes a conversation between them, it more times than not turns into one person with this view and one person with this view, and then all of a sudden that kind of creates a bit of a log jam for the flow of the conversation and what it potentially could be. So I was just wondering if you ever sort of come across these kind of ways in which you can more facilitate, not necessarily like topics or anything like that. It's not like pick it out of a hat at a dinner party and here's what we're going to talk about. But does anybody have any things or techniques they might use to just kind of have topics that are kind of warm and feel good and just happy moments? I try to, with my own work, I try to ask open-ended questions and listen a lot and like get people telling stories about their past, which more than often are not political, and they're just about warm experiences that they might have had. So anyway, so it's just my question, and again, thank you everybody so much.
Well, I can jump in to start, and I think this is where um, joining a club or volunteering can just be such a wonderful experience because you're often united in a particular interest, and that becomes a way to connect outside of your different political views. And so you're connecting on something that you share in common, even though you might have different ideologies and different viewpoints. And I think that's been what some scholars have said is one of the biggest roots of the problem of polarization today is we're not joining clubs and volunteering like we used to. And so we don't actually know how to relate well with people that aren't like us. We only now know how to be with people that share the same viewpoints. And that obviously is creating a lot of challenges. So I like just a very practical tip if people have the capacity and ability to is I think bond over a common interest, whether it's through volunteering or starting a group or, if everyone likes to walk, go join a walking group. So I think that is like one positive way. But I also like what you shared too about asking people about their histories and backgrounds and travel can be another unifying experience to talk about, but I'm sure others have some good suggestions.
Anyone else want to share anything?
Well, I love, Rachel, what you said about volunteering. Our program was dependent, it was based on the Australian program, How Are You? Judy Lothian's work, and it was dependent on volunteers. So, and I've been working with volunteers in delirium prevention. That's my main focus of research for 15 years now. But the thing that the research shows is that the volunteer is always helped more than the person they're putatively helping, right? So engaging in volunteers is volunteers work is a nice neutral way, I'm a pretty chatty person, but even myself, I find, like I was getting into this habit of like hopping in the ride share, and just looking at my phone, and I started trying to make a point of engaging, usually over the music, right? That so I was learning a lot about really cool music from all around the world because Toronto is Toronto, right? And you're gonna get some real tips, and just looking for all those opportunities, as an individual, and then the last point I wanted to make, they've recently come out with this study showing that people who had prescribed exercise programs after colon cancer, right, did so much better. And I'm really interested. I think future research will show that, it was the degree of connectedness that was, a contributor as much as the actual physical exercise. And so when we were preparing to do the How Are You, we did a systematic review of systematic reviews, and um, programs where when you're shared in doing something like we partnered with making Art Make Change, MAMC. And what that is it's a group, everybody gets this box that's full of art supplies. And then it was online because this was a COVID project, and people made art together. Some people who had never done art, people who had done art together virtually, right? And that was featured on CBC, so that shared activity is something that's really important and helpful, so it can be exercise, it can be birding, it can be, it's that shared doing a shared thing. And that just gives you the one thing that you can connect on that's not, that's neutral, that's apolitical, and help, and you can help skate through the increasing, really cynical pressure to divide us for for self-interest, right? So that the division in society is not an accident. It's manufactured. It's intentional, and we the well-intentioned need to fight against that with every fiber of our body.
Agreed. That's such a powerful way to end this, you know, these small intentional ways to find our similarities and our common ground. Because I think a lot of us realize when we spend just a little bit of time with other people that we have more in common than we think we do. So with that, thank you all so much for being here and for engaging in this wonderful conversation. We're so grateful to our panelists for being here and sharing your expertise. We're so grateful for everyone who's tuning in, both online and who will be watching the recording. I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day, and please sign up for Seniors Loneliness Awareness Week and make a commitment to getting connected with an older adult in your life in however that looks for you. And with that, have a great day. I'm going to stop the recording now.